Welcome to Salt Session. My name is Kiramode, and today I'm going to be talking about life as a resource. So, in your case, maybe you haven't played many card games, so it's possible that your background before you played this game was, you've only played like Yu-Gi-Oh, or you've only played like Pokemon, or maybe you only played like Magic, one of the big three, or maybe you've only played Hearthstone or no card games. So, a lot of the things that exist in this card game might be different to you than they've been in other games. Although if you have a deep enough background in card games, everything just kind of makes sense. And that's where I hope to relay that information to this game to give a better understanding of how a lot of players play. Because if you notice, when good players play, they all have a very general sense of playing this game with regards to life. Like, most good players will just aggressively take life as much as they can and then aggressively protect life. And it takes bad players a long time, or not even necessarily bad players, just new players. It takes them a long time to either figure this out, and they don't even fully understand why they're doing that. They just know, hey, I saw this good player do that, so I'm going to do that. But not really understanding, why are the good players doing this in the first place? Why is it that the good players in like 2 seconds figure out that this is how you should play the game? And that's where I come in. So to start this off, I'm going to give a crash course on how life operates in pretty much every card game, and how resources just operate in every card game. And the vast majority of games that I've played tend to have 3 basic resources. One is your literal resources, right? We're talking like your mana, your energy, your crystals, right? Whatever you use to pay for cards on the table. The second is your cards themselves. And then the third one is your life. So I'll just go through each one of these. As for resources, in games that have resources, you for the most part have 2 basic types of resources. One resource type is curve based. So it's like turn 1, you get a resource. Turn 2, you get another resource. Turn 3, you get a resource. And it necessitates that your deck have some sort of a curve, right? Because if your deck is a whole bunch of 5-cost cards, turns 1 through 4, you're not doing shit. But also, you can't have a whole bunch of 1-drop cost cards, because then you're just playing weenies, and when it's time to play the big cards, you don't have them. So you need to have a curve if you have any sort of curve-based resource mechanic. And then other games have more steady resources. So for fixed resource games, it's more like every turn you just get X amount of resources, unless you have any sort of other ramp mechanics. And then there's hybrids. There's some games I call accelerated curve resources, where it's like you start at, say, 3 or 4 resources, but then every turn past that, you still have the option to play a resource and then keep curving up. A good example of this would be something like Codex, where you start off with 4 or 5, depending if you go first or second, but then you can still optionally drop a mana every turn and then still get more. In either case, though, all of these games necessitate either a curve or not curve for your deck, just based on whether or not you have a curve-based system, or if you have a fixed system will determine how you can play your cards. If you have a fixed-based system, you don't need a curve. You just need to play the most valuable cards you can possibly play for whatever their effect is relative to their mana cost. Whereas if you're playing a curve-based game, you gotta have like your 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s kind of perfectly calibrated for the deck. And that's just how your resources work in a nutshell. Then you have your cards. And when it comes to card draw games usually will either have a static card draw or a refill card draw. So most games are static card draws, and the way static card draw games work is you start your game with X amount of cards, and then every turn you draw X amount other cards. So for example, in Magic, you start off with 7, every turn you draw 1 card. In DBS, you start off with 6, every turn you draw 1. In Game of Thrones, you start off with 7, every turn you draw 2. It just sort of depends. And then there are refill games. So the way refill draw games work is like Star Wars the card game works this way, where you start off with 6, you play as many cards as you want to play during your turn, and then you refill up to 6. So depending on which version of the game you're playing will determine how stingy you need to be with your cards. If you're playing a static draw game, your cards are incredibly valuable, because you need to make sure that you're not just spamming cards out, because you want to make sure you have more cards for later. In refill games, you kind of don't give a fuck. Like, if you're playing a refill based card game, you actually want to play as many cards as you can every turn, because if you're consistently playing 2 cards a turn and then drawing 2 off your deck, but I'm playing 5 cards a turn and I'm drawing 5 off the top of my deck, I'm not only playing more cards for value on the table, I'm also seeing more cards so I can play more cards. So I just get a bunch of card advantage on you. And so depending on the style of game you're playing will determine how you evaluate cards. And then the last one is life. And the way life works is when it comes to life systems in games, for the most part, you're either looking at fluid life for games, or you're looking at more discrete. And the way I classify those is fluid life is I deal damage to you, and then depending on what the number is on my attacking card will determine how much life you take. An example of this is in Hearthstone, you start off with 30 life. If I have a guy with 7 attack and he swings face, you lose 7 life. And you lose the game when all of your fluid resources hit 0. That's for the most part how fluid life-based games work. Then you have discrete games. And so discrete life, the way those work is you have to hit a threshold. So an example of this would be in Legend of the Five Rings. The threshold for most objectives are 4. So you have to win a battle by 4, and then you can destroy this, like one of their provinces. And then the difference between fluid and discrete, outside of the fact that one's more threshold and one's just any amount of damage, is generally in fluid-based card games for life, you can gain the life back for the most part. Like almost every single fluid-based game, you have a mechanic that says if you're low on life, you can gain life. Whereas in games that are more discrete, for the most part, when you lose a life, you can't get it back. So in like Legend of the Five Rings, if your opponent blows up 4 of your strongholds, you lose. So if you lose 2 strongholds, you don't get them back. And on the other hand, in Magic, you can lose 19 life, and there's going to be a card that just lets you gain 15. So the function of that, like in terms of how you treat your life, changes. Generally, life in fluid games is not very valuable because you can just sort of get it back. Like as long as you have a couple burst heals in your deck, you can recover. Whereas in discrete card games, life is a little bit more precious because there's no way to get it back. If you're down to your last life or your last stronghold, you're just there. Like your opponent only takes 1 nut draw and then you lose. So now let's talk about DBS in particular. DBS, as far as resources go, is definitely a curve-based game. And in curve-based games, your resources are a little bit more precious than they are in, more static resource management or accelerated resource curves. So you really want to make sure you use them. And then also, your resources don't carry over turn to turn. So some games, might be resource curve-based, but then you can carry over the mana. You can't do that in this game. So in this game, if you don't use your mana, you lose it. So it's very important that every single resource that you have gets used if at all possible. Like floating resources is just really bad if you do that for an extended period of time. Then as for the card draw, we know this game is a static card draw. You start off with your 6 and you're just drawing the 1 per turn. And in static card draw games, cards, again, they're more valuable. So just knowing that out of the gate, when you play DBS, you should approach this game understanding that your cards are more valuable than they are in a lot of other games, and your resources are more valuable than they are in a lot of card games. And then the last one is your life. Now the life here in DBS is a threshold base, right? We have more discrete life. So in order to deal a life to me as a player, you have to be able to meet the threshold. Now the threshold is flexible. So in this case, my threshold is my leader. So you have to be able to make an attack worth 1500, and then I have to not combo out of it. So you might have to combo up to ensure that the life gets dealt. But for the most part, it's like, you're going to put like a 20k guy at my leader, and then I have to decide, okay, do I want to burn 2 5ks to stop this, or do I want to burn a super combo to stop this, or do I just want to eat the life? And that's something that you kind of just have to decide. Now normally that would make it actually really valuable too, but what makes DBS a little bit different from other games is that by and large, when a game has threshold-based life, usually the amount of damage you have to deal to your opponent is only like 3 or 4. Like when people have a life-based system like that, it's not that much that you would be expected to do. But this one's a little different because you have 8 life, which 8 life is a lot. So you can realistically just eat life and it doesn't really matter. Like, you don't have to protect yourself like you would in other games. So it kind of fucks up the equation a little bit. So as far as the base mechanics go, your cards and your resources are incredibly valuable, but your life actually isn't. It's really probably your least valuable of the three basic types of resources, just because you have so much of it to start the game. Whereas if this game operated more like other games operated, so if, like, let's say you started with 4 life, now every one of your resources is incredibly precious, and the game is just completely different. The game at that point would actually be much more value based if that happened, because players would be incredibly scared to lose life, and players would also be very scared to lose any of their other resources. So like, it'd be a big game of chicken. But with this game based mechanic having 8 life, it makes it so players know what they can immediately lose and then what they have to hold on to for dear life. Now, in all these games, you always have an ability to trade life for resources, or trade your resources for cards or whatever. So in Magic, there's cards that say pay, X amount of life, and now this card gets reduced in cost. So at that point, you're leveraging your life as a resource instead of mana. On the other hand, there's cards that might say pay 4 resources, draw 2 cards. So in that case, you're leveraging your actual mana in exchange for card value. And then you also might have burst heals, which say, pay a certain amount of mana, gain a bunch of life. So there's ways that you can always trade one resource type for another. But on top of that, there's more, how to put it this way? There's more abstract ways to trade life. So an example of this would be, in Hearthstone, I think is a good one of this. There was a time in Hearthstone where you could play a card called Reno. And the way Reno worked is he was a burst heal. He let you heal all the way up to your life. So, regardless if you were at 1 or you were at, 15, you're healing back up to 30. So the key with Reno is he functionally made it so your life acted as cards. So if you as an opponent, if you burned, say, 5 cards to get me from 30 life down to 5 life, like let's say each card on average does 5 damage to me. So you just burned 5 cards to get me down to 5 life. I, with 1 card, can negate all of that work. So that was the primary value of that card. It's just the amount of card advantage that you can generate off of him was huge. And quite frankly, unfair. But even if you took Reno out, right? Even if you said, okay, we're going to ignore him, and let's think about a game like Magic, and let's say Magic doesn't have any burst heals. There's a saying in Magic, which is that 1 and 20 are the same thing. And the reason they say that is that it doesn't matter whether you're at 20 or whether you're at 1. As long as you win the game, that's all it takes. So with control decks in that game in particular, if you're playing a heavy control game, you're basically going to have kill spells for any creature that they bring on the board. You're also probably going to have counters for any direct damage that they could conceivably have. And you can have a wall of weenies to block any attacks they can have. So like, sometimes your goal in that game is you just want to erect a fortress that they can never get past, and that's all you care about. Like, once that fortress is built, they have no chance of ever doing anything to you. So once you do that, again, it doesn't matter. 1 and 20, same thing. So if you're playing that style of deck, this is where it's really important to use your life early as a way to leverage things. So if you as a player say, I'm going to play a card that does damage to you, I as a player have roughly 2 ways to deal with it. One is I can play some sort of card that deals with it. Hopefully the card that I play that deals with it is less valuable than the card you used to try to hurt me. Or I can just take it. So if I'm playing Magic and I know that with my 20 life, I can absorb 4 to 5 blows of damage from my opponent's cards before I have to actually start giving a fuck, what that means is those 4 or 5 cards that I would have ordinarily used to stop your attacks, I can now use to build my board. And once I just build my board up to the point where you can't do anything, then I win the game. So that's where you're functionally trading your life for cards even if you don't have the burst heal, it's still the same thing. You're just leveraging different resources for another. And then again, there's other card games where you're directly paying, mana for cards, or cards for mana, right? In DBS, we see people play Energy Trunks and Sensu Bean all the time. With those ones, if you're using them offensively, you're trading cards in exchange for mana, because you want to be able to accelerate. You just need to have, X amount of mana to be able to do your combos to win the game. So at that point, you don't really care that you're down a card, because you're not looking for long-term value. You're looking for immediate mana, because that's more valuable the earlier you are in the game. And especially in curve-based games, mana have extra value with them, especially if you can, ramp that out really fast. So in DBS in particular, life carries a much more direct correlation to cards than it does in other games. In other games, the value that life has to cards is just, I can absorb your card damage to myself, and my life effectively counts as a card. In this game, your life literally counts as a card. So here, when you take life, you draw a card. So if you have 8 life, your life represents 7 card draw that you can potentially get. Furthermore, in this game, if you get beat down to 4, you have an added bonus of you get more resources. So if you get hit down to 4 and you awaken, you're either getting 2 mana or you're getting 2 cards. And that just gets further factored into the equation. So we're talking about a game that already in its base mechanics, life isn't as valuable as it would otherwise be for a discrete life-based system. It now is even less valuable, in terms of something you need to protect, because you're drawing a card off of it. So if you expend 3 cards to deal damage to me, not only are you losing 3 cards out of your hand to hurt me, I also gain 3 cards out of my life because you attacked me. So that's a 6-card swing that you just triggered right there. And most of the time in DBS, when players try to deal damage right now, they ideally want to do either crit damage, so that way you're at least, it's like a trade a card for card, or they try to deal damage in ways that don't matter, right? Like you do leader attacks, the poke, or you'll just have other weenies that just give you repetitive value, because enough players understand that simply slamming a card on the table to deal damage is actually a really, really bad value play, because your opponent can always just eat the damage. And as long as your opponent can eat the damage, you're losing card value in the long term. Furthermore, you also see a lot of self-awakening cards. So usually in card games, when you have the ability to deal life to yourself, it's kind of something you have to think about really hard. It's like, if I want to play this spell, but it costs me 3 life to play, it's like, do I really want to do that? And the answer a lot of times is no, unless you're a really aggressive deck. But within the context of DBS, it's actually not. Like in this game, one of the reasons Bardock is so busted is that he doesn't let you just take 1 life. He lets you take all your life that you want. So you could just keep playing them and bouncing them and playing them and bouncing them. And there's so much value in just dealing damage to yourself, because you're drawing all these cards, which gives you options for the late game. And on top of that, it also allows you to awaken, which gives you further bonuses. So you can just accelerate your game plan and get to the point that you're going to have a board that your opponent can never deal with. Now, for the most part, in this episode, for the first 15 minutes or so, I've been talking about life as a way that you can, for the most part, just kamikaze yourself. But if you notice, what good players do is they hit a point where their gears just shift. They go from, I want to take as much life as possible, to, I never want to take another life. And the reason for that is, once you get down to 3 or 4, and you stop getting all the same bonuses, now the game goes back to being your regular threshold-based life game. So in games where you have thresholds, if you only have 3 or 4 bases that you have to protect in another card game, players will generally defend those bases really, really, really well. So when I play Legend of the Five Rings, that's a game that is a stronghold-based game. I rarely want to lose my strongholds. I'm okay sacrificing 1 or 2 throughout the course of the game, but I never want to lose 3. Because once people are knocking at the door for the 4th one, it's really scary, and you just know the tiniest thing can just blow you out of the water. So you really want to protect yourself in that game. You want to protect all of them if you can. Whereas, In DBS, I kind of don't care. You just take as much damage. But much like other games, once you hit, your 3 or 4 in DBS, now you really want to protect it. Because the problem is in DBS, once you get down to 1 or 2, you know that it only takes one big combo turn and you lose. You know that it only takes, like, if you're at 2 life, they can swing in with a weenie, and then they just play a shitload of super combos and one Champa, and all of a sudden you're just out. Especially if your hand has a bunch of extra cards, like maybe you have flutes or negates or other cards that are still useful, cards you want in your deck, but cards that you just can't 100% use right now. That could just end the game. So what ends up happening is players, in an effort to avoid that, they try to keep themselves at 3. And if your opponent has triple strikes, they try to keep themselves at 4. There just hits a point where I call it the the tipping point of where you want to be life-wise. So for example, if I'm playing against a Storm deck, that tipping point is 3 life, because I know the way that Storm works is they're going to come at me and they're just going to try to dump their hand with one Champa and finish me off. So what I need to do is I need to take as much life as I can up until 3. And once I'm at 3, then I have to actually start defending my life, because I know the moment I go down to 2, I'm opening the door for them to do this. On the other hand, if I'm playing against Victory Strike, there is no threshold. If you're playing against Victory Strike, being at 1 and being at 8 are literally the same thing. So if they're ever attacking you, you're just freely taking that damage, because that's also a deck that has a bunch of 10k cards. So they're not going to be able to dump their whole hand and just blow you out of the water. That's not what they do. They're going to try to Victory Strike you. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to try to create a wall that prevents Victory Strike from ever getting to your life. And in an effort, and the easiest way to make sure you can build that wall is to draw as many cards as you can possibly draw, because that way you can draw into the cards like Vegito, like barrier blockers, or possibly a Crusher Ball that can make sure that situation never manifests itself, and they're going to have to try to find another way to beat you. Another example of this would be, there's the 8-drop Goku from Swap, which his ability is you tap out all of your opponent's shit and then he gets to swing twice and he has triple strike on each one. This is another example where your tipping point's different. Your tipping point at that point is 4. So you want to make sure you're at 4 life with at least, a Vegito or something to protect yourself, or you need to float a lot of mana, because what's going to happen is he's going to take away so many options from you that you need to make sure you either have more options than he can take away from you with this tap ability, or just have enough life that he's not going to be able to just one-shot you. He's going to have to hit you for 3, you draw 3 cards, and maybe you combo out of the second one or something. That's just going to have to be how you approach that matchup, because you need to make sure you're at that tipping point. Or at the tipping point on the correct side, not on the lower side, because once you start taking damage past that, it just becomes way too scary. You're just opening the door for your opponent to win. So to summarize this video, if you're playing this game and you don't 100% understand why is it that good players just aggressively take life, and then why they just aggressively protect their life, but then sometimes just seem to not give a fuck either, and it just seems inconsistent, this is why. Good players understand that your first 4 life are just completely worthless. You want to take that as fast as you can, because you want to awaken as fast as you can. You want to get those extra bonuses, and you want to get those cards in your hand. It's just way too valuable than protecting it. Protecting it is just stupid. But once you get past that, once you're already awakened, your bonuses are less, because you no longer have that extra carrot of awakening. You also, all your super combos are already active, and now you're closer to that tipping point. And again, against different decks, that tipping point's different. Right? Different matchups will determine what your tipping point is, and part of being a good player is understanding where your tipping point is in different matchups. If your tipping point doesn't exist, you go down to 1. If your tipping point is 4, then you just make sure your ass is at 4 no matter what. And if you ever get down below that, you're probably toasting that game anyways. And that's one way that you can kind of set yourself apart, is just, understand what your deck does, understand what your opponent's decks do, and then understanding that your life is a resource. I've met a lot of players, in not just in this game, but in other games, that they try to overprotect their life, and they don't think of their life as a resource. There's a lot of players that I've seen that they'll say things like, yeah man, I was playing this guy and this game was so close, we were both at 1 life, and they think that it's an accomplishment, and it's not. Like, you have to understand when you're playing a game, the amount of life you have doesn't really matter. It really doesn't. Your goal is to be in a winning position. Now, if you tell me, hey, I had my opponent at 1 and I comboed out and he was barely able to escape by 5k, that's a close game. You know, that's a very close game. But if your opponent's at 1, but they had 6 more cards than you in their hand, and then they had 3 more guys than you on the table, and they had enough blockers to stop any attack you could ever have, and they have negates in hand, and they're playing SS3, so every turn they have mana to play any card that they want, you're never going to win that game. Like, they let themselves get down to 1, and you think you had a chance to win, but you really didn't. And that's where I think you can easily determine whether players are good or bad, or whether they understand this, is just how do they talk about life. You know, life, I think, is a pretty base concept in games. And for the most part, every game has a certain amount of life that you're able to absorb. And DBS just happens to have more than other games in terms of how much you're able to soak up and use as resources for later. And that's all it is for this episode. It's probably a good one to start off with. I'm not super mad in this episode. I'll be more mad in subsequent episodes. But I'll try to make sure that the first couple episodes are just clean concept-based videos where you can hopefully learn something. Till next time.